Centuries before Blackwood Academy existed, even as a madman's dream, Elias knelt before an obsidian monolith in a hidden chamber. The air clung thick, heavy with the metallic tang of old blood and acrid ozone. The stench seeped into the cracks of the stone walls, settled into the fibers of frayed ancient tapestries. The stone's surface swallowed torchlight instead of reflecting it, a dark mirror drinking every flicker of flame. The whispering stone, raw and untamed, thrummed with primordial energy. The vibration crawled up the stone floor, settled deep in Elias's bones, a dark melody of forbidden power that hummed in time with his racing heart. Sweat beaded on his brow, mixing with ritual ash and the cold sweat of desperate ambition. His family line had fallen to ruin, generation after generation, their glory slipping through their fingers grain by grain. He believed this power would yank his name back from ruin, lifted above every other house in the realm. He curled his fingers around the hilt of a silver-handled dagger. Sweat made his grip slip. He wiped his palm on his thigh, curled his fingers tight again, and began a guttural incantation. It was a language lost to all but the oldest of bloodlines. When the last syllable rolled off his tongue, he drove the dagger into a shallow basin carved into the stone's base. Blood did not flow from the cut. Instead, a viscous, shimmering ichor welled up, drawn straight from the core of the earth. The whispering stone pulsed faster, its dark heart beating in lockstep with Elias's frantic pulse. Thick, rope-like tendrils of shadow snaked out from the stone's surface. They coiled through the air and bit straight through the flimsy wards Elias had spent months weaving. A low, resonant hum began deep in the earth's foundations. It rose, rattling the rafters, shaking the ground under Elias's knees. Stone blocks groaned in their frames. Mortar crumbled to dust. Elias's raw, uncontrolled magic clashed with the stone's ancient power. He was already being consumed by a force far greater than he could ever command. The shadows thickened, coiling into swirling vortexes that screamed through the air. Suddenly, a blinding flash of incandescent light exploded through the doorway. Alaric Thorne stood silhouetted against the chaos, his voice cut clean through the cacophony. "Elias, you fool. You tamper with forces you cannot comprehend." What had once been a fragile friendship shattered beyond repair. With a final desperate surge of light magic, Thorne pushed the shadows back, forced them to retreat into the stone. He sealed it with a complex array of ancient runes. Yet even as the chamber stopped shaking, a dark corruption had stained the foundations. The hum faded to a low thrum, but it never stopped entirely. Elias lay unconscious on the broken floor, his face frozen in horror. Thorne stood gasping, staring at the inert stone. It remained a dormant power, waiting for its next awakening. A permanent curse, staining the future of Blackwood Academy forever. The wrought iron gates of Blackwood Academy rose from the mist like skeletal fingers, clawing at the bruised New England sky. Rain drummed a steady, rhythmic beat against the cold stone, turning the cobblestones into a slick, dark mirror. Alistair remained in the passenger seat, letting the engine idle. The vibration hummed through the floorboards, a low, rhythmic growl that cut through the oppressive quiet of the grounds. Outside, the manor loomed, its spires clawing at the low-hanging clouds like jagged teeth. He leaned back, eyes tracing the intricate, dark stonework that seemed to pulse with a faint, residual energy. It was a monument to tradition, a fortress of rigid, ancient expectations. Graves cleared his throat, the sound sharp and intrusive in the confined space. "We are here, Master Alistair." The Academy felt like a cage, meticulously crafted to keep the world outside at bay. He let out a slow, measured breath, feeling the cold seep through the glass. With a sharp, practiced sneer, he reached for the handle. The door clicked open and he stepped out. The gravel crunched under his weight, a harsh, discordant sound against the stillness. Alistair did not move immediately. He watched a single lantern swing in the wind, its flame struggling against the damp, heavy air. He stood for a moment, letting the damp chill settle into his skin, and looked up at the towering facade. The building seemed to lean inward, watching him. He adjusted his stance, locked his gaze on the heavy oak doors, and began the walk toward the entrance. He was ready to see how it would react to his arrival. Ahead, the path wound toward the main structure, a sprawling Gothic beast of obsidian and mortar. As he walked, the magically charged lanterns lining the walkway pulsed, their light flickering with a rhythmic, erratic intensity. They seemed to track his movement, casting long, jagged shadows that danced against the walls. The air here tasted metallic. He stopped at the threshold of the courtyard, head tilted back to survey the spires piercing the clouds above. He took a breath, felt the cold seep into his lungs, and pushed forward. The academy was waiting. The heavy oak doors groaned as Alistair pushed them open. He stepped into the great hall, a cavernous expanse defined by obsidian floors, and towering stained glass that muted the daylight into thin, sickly shafts of color. The air inside was thick, vibrating with the hum of magical signatures. As he moved toward the center of the hall, the ambient energy shifted. It rippled outward from his path like water disturbed by a stone. Students milled about in clusters, their voices a constant, low-frequency murmur that filled the space. As he passed the first row of stone pillars, the chatter faltered, heads turned. The rhythmic, ordered flow of the room stuttered, then broke. He was a foreign element in their environment, and the very air seemed to thicken with resistance. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, ignoring the sharp glances and the sudden, uneasy silence. The lanterns overhead flickered, their flames dimming as he drew near, then flaring back to life once he had passed. He reached the center of the hall and stopped. He stood still, letting the weight of the room press against him. He was an anomaly, and he felt the collective gaze of the academy tightening around him. The silence in the hall was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Alistair held his position, his boots planted firmly on the cold obsidian floor. He watched the crowd, waiting for the inevitable. From the periphery, the sea of students parted, creating a clean, straight path. A figure emerged, moving with a fluid, practiced grace that stood in stark contrast to the surrounding stillness. Julian Thorne stopped 5 paces away. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate. He simply occupied the space, his presence drawing the focus of every eye in the room. Julian tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over Alistair with a clinical, detached precision. There was no warmth in his expression, only a cold, measured calculation that sought to dismantle Alistair before a single word was spoken. Alistair remained motionless, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing steady. He watched the way Julian's eyes narrowed, the slight tension in his jaw, the way he held his shoulders back with an air of absolute authority. Julian took one final, deliberate step forward. He cleared his throat. "Alistair Finchwood," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "How unexpected." Alistair did not blink. He let the silence stretch, allowing Julian's words to hang in the air, unacknowledged and unanswered. He shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the obsidian floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the cavernous room. He turned his head slightly, scanning the faces of the students nearby. They were watching, their expressions a mix of curiosity and practiced detachment. He turned back to Julian, his lips curling into a thin, sardonic smile that never reached his eyes. Alistair let his gaze linger on Julian's face, tracing the rigid line of his jaw and the cold focus in his eyes. He leaned in, just an inch, closing the gap until he could hear the steady rhythm of Julian's breathing. The air between them felt thin, ionized by the proximity of their conflicting energies. "Julian Thorne," he said, the name rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Still playing the part of the Academy's shining beacon, I see." He watched the flicker of irritation cross Julian's features, a momentary lapse in his composure. The hostility in the room intensified. Julian's jaw tightened, the muscles along his cheekbone pulsing with sudden, sharp pressure. He did not retreat. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence expanding to fill the narrow space between them. His eyes remained fixed on Alistair, cold and unyielding. "Some traditions, Finchwood, are worth upholding," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Unlike others who seem intent on tearing them down." The statement was not merely a critique of behavior. It was a deliberate invocation of the past. He gestured vaguely toward the surrounding architecture, his hand movements precise and controlled. The air grew heavy, thick with the phantom weight of centuries of conflict. Julian's gaze sharpened, stripping away the pretense of their current rivalry to reveal the deeper, jagged history of their bloodlines. He stood tall, his posture rigid, embodying the legacy he defended with such fervor. Alistair watched him, noting the way Julian's hands balled into tight fists at his sides. The accusation hung in the air, a physical barrier between them that no amount of wit could easily dismantle. Every student in the hall seemed to hold their breath, sensing the shift. Julian's eyes flickered with a dark, ancestral scorn, confirming that for him, this was never just about the present moment. It was about the ghosts that followed them both into the room. The air in the hall shifted, the previous tension between the two rivals abruptly eclipsed by a sudden, collective stillness. Conversations died in the throats of the students. Heads turned toward the front of the cavernous space. A heavy, rhythmic sound echoed against the obsidian walls, the slow, deliberate strike of a staff against stone. Professor Alaric Thorne emerged from the shadows of the dais, his movements fluid and predatory. He did not look at the crowd. He looked through them. His eyes, sharp as flints, swept across the expanse of the hall, ignoring the bowing heads and the nervous shuffling of feet. He moved with a calculated grace, ascending the steps to the elevated platform until he stood above the entire assembly. The silence he brought with him was absolute, a vacuum that pulled the oxygen from the room. Then, his gaze stopped. It locked onto Alistair with the precision of a trap snapping shut. The professor did not smile. He held his position, his eyes boring into Alistair, turning the vast hall into a singular, focused point of judgment. The professor remained on the dais, his posture rigid, his hands resting lightly on the polished stone railing. He did not blink. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight that pressed against the chests of every student in the hall. Finally, he spoke. His voice was not loud, yet it carried with a resonant, metallic clarity that reached the furthest corners of the obsidian chamber. "Welcome, students," he began, his tone devoid of warmth. He paused, his gaze drifting slowly across the room before snapping back to Alistair with renewed intensity. "May your studies be fruitful." He leaned forward, the movement subtle but deliberate, narrowing the distance between himself and the assembly. The air seemed to grow colder, the ambient light in the hall dimming as if the shadows themselves were obeying his command. "And your magic?" he continued, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register that vibrated through the floorboards, contained. The word hung in the air, sharp and jagged. The professor held the final syllable, letting the weight of the warning settle over the room like a shroud. The word contained echoed in the hollow space of Alistair's mind, a sharp, metallic ring that refused to dissipate. Beneath his ribs, a familiar, searing heat began to bloom, spreading outward from his center like ink dropped into clear water. It was a volatile, rhythmic pulse, coiling tight against his diaphragm. He drew a sharp, shallow breath, trying to force the sensation down, but the energy surged in response, clawing at the edges of his restraint. His stomach tightened, a knot of raw, kinetic pressure that demanded release. He shifted his weight, his boots grinding against the cold stone floor, trying to ground himself in the physical world. The air around him seemed to thicken, vibrating with the strain of his effort. He pressed his palms against his sides, his fingers digging into his own skin. He kept his head bowed, staring at the floor, watching as the blood drained from his hands. His knuckles turned stark white, the heat intensified, a burning, restless current that refused to be silenced. He stood rigid, a statue of forced composure, while the storm raged beneath his skin. The pressure inside Alistair hit a breaking point, a silent, violent expansion that defied his grip. His focus fractured. As his willpower wavered, the ambient magic of the Great Hall reacted instantly to his instability. Above the rows of students, the floating lanterns began to jerk in midair. They did not just flicker, they spasmed, their flames turning from a steady golden glow to a frantic, jagged violet. The light within the chamber pulsed in sync with the erratic rhythm of his own heart. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to emanate from the stone floor, vibrating upward through the soles of his boots. The heavy, obsidian pillars groaned, the sound of shifting masonry echoing through the cavernous space like a warning. Students shifted, their heads snapping toward the source of the disturbance, their murmurs dying into a sharp, collective intake of breath. Alistair felt the air grow ionized, the static charge raising the hair on his arms. The floor beneath him gave a sudden, sharp lurch, as if the very foundation of the academy was losing its purchase on the earth. The equilibrium of the room had shattered. The great hall groaned. It was not the sound of settling stone, but the screech of ancient magic fighting to maintain order. High above, the protective wards, invisible webs of energy woven into the architecture, began to manifest as faint, shimmering lines of white light. They crackled. The sound was sharp, like dry branches snapping under a heavy boot. Every time Alistair's internal pressure spiked, the wards flared, pulsing in a desperate attempt to suppress the leaking power. A high-pitched, rhythmic whine began to permeate the room, a sound so thin and piercing it made the students press their hands to their ears. The obsidian walls, usually cold and unyielding, now vibrated with a frantic, buzzing intensity. Dust shook loose from the vaulted ceiling, raining down in slow gray drifts that caught the flickering violet light. The air grew thin, stripped of its oxygen by the sheer density of the magical friction. Alistair stood at the center of this tightening coil, his body rigid, his jaw locked. He could feel the wards scraping against his own aura, a grinding sensation that sent jolts of pain down his spine. The entire room held its breath. The final barrier snapped. It was not a sound, but a sudden, absolute cessation of the ward's whine. Alistair's restraint dissolved, and the energy he had been holding back surged outward with the force of a physical blow. A shockwave of raw, unchecked power tore through the great hall, radiating from his center like a ripple in a dark pond. The air turned heavy, then instantly displaced, creating a vacuum that pulled the breath from the lungs of everyone nearby. The floating lanterns did not just swing. They exploded in a shower of glass and violet sparks. The shockwave hit the obsidian walls, and the stone shuddered, sending a deep, resonant boom echoing through the entire structure. Students were knocked off balance, their carefully maintained composure collapsing into a chaotic scramble for footing. Alistair stood at the epicenter, his chest heaving, the remnants of the power still crackling along his skin like static. The structural integrity of the Great Hall failed in a series of violent, rhythmic cracks. Deep fissures spiderwebbed across the obsidian floor, radiating outward from where Alistair stood. The massive stone pillars supporting the vaulted ceiling groaned, their surfaces shedding flakes of rock that clattered like hail against the ground. Above, the stained glass windows shattered, raining shards of colored light onto the panicked crowd below. Students scrambled, their movements frantic and uncoordinated as the floor tilted beneath them. A heavy chandelier, severed from its moorings by the shifting ceiling, plummeted into the center of the room, smashing into the dais with a deafening roar. The air was thick with pulverized stone and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Panic transformed the orderly hall into a theater of terror. Some students pressed themselves into the corners, shielding their heads from the falling debris, while others sprinted toward the exits, slipping on the slick, fractured floor. The very foundations of Blackwood were buckling, the ground beneath them pitching like the deck of a ship in a storm. The once imposing hall was now a crumbling cage. The roar of shifting stone reached a crescendo, then abruptly died as a single commanding presence dominated the dais. Professor Alaric Thorne stood amidst the wreckage, his posture rigid and his movements devoid of the frantic energy that gripped the room. He did not shout. He did not move to shield himself. Instead, he raised a hand, and the air around him seemed to solidify, dampening the lingering tremors. His gaze cut through the swirling dust, bypassing the terrified students and the falling masonry to lock directly onto Alistair. It was a look of cold, surgical assessment. The fury behind his eyes was not the wild, uncontrolled heat of the surge, but a calculated, icy judgment. As Thorne held his stare, the violet sparks still dancing around Alistair's skin began to dim. The dark energy retracted into the shadows. The whine of the strained wards faded into a low, dying hum. Thorne did not blink. He watched the last of the power bleed away. The hall fell into a sudden, stifling stillness. Thorne remained motionless, pinning Alistair to the spot with the weight of his scrutiny. Alistair stood alone in the center of the wreckage, his muscles locked in a tremor he could not suppress. The energy had vanished, leaving behind a hollow, aching cold that settled deep into his marrow. He tried to draw a full breath, but the air felt thin, tainted by the bitter scent of scorched stone and ozone. Every nerve ending pulsed with the ghost of the power he had just unleashed. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Around him, the great hall was a tomb of silence. The students remained frozen, their eyes fixed on him. The silence was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, pressing against his chest. He shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the jagged debris, and the sharp sound echoed like a gunshot. He forced his shoulders back, fighting the urge to collapse, and kept his gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence shattered. A single deliberate footstep crunched against the stone debris, followed by another. Julian moved from the periphery of the crowd, his path cutting a straight line toward the center of the hall. He did not rush. He walked with the measured, rhythmic pace of someone who owned the very ground he trod upon. Every eye in the room tracked his movement, shifting from the wreckage to the confrontation unfolding in the center. Julian stopped just inches from Alistair, his presence imposing, his posture radiating a calm, predatory certainty. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, serrated edge. "It seems, Finchwood, that some things never change." Julian's gaze remained locked on Alistair. "You carry your family's blight like a badge of honor, flaunting the very rot that should have been buried." Julian stood his ground, his jaw set, waiting for the impact of his words to sink into the heavy, stagnant air of the hall. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Alistair felt the familiar dark heat coil in his gut, but he forced it down, clamping his teeth together until his jaw ached. He did not look away. He did not flinch. Instead, he let the weight of Julian's words settle, feeling the cold sting of the insult turn into a hard, sharp clarity. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the air whistling through his nostrils, and planted his feet firmly against the uneven floor. He felt the eyes of the entire academy watching, waiting for him to crumble, to apologize, or to lash out in blind rage. He gave them none of those things. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze narrowing until it was a focused, burning point of intent. He looked directly into Julian's eyes, refusing to acknowledge the surrounding judgment or the history that Julian sought to weaponize. Every second that passed in the silence felt like a victory. He was the anomaly, the outcast, the blight, and he owned every part of it. He did not blink. He did not retreat. He held the space between them. The standoff stretched, the air between them thick with the static of unspoken threats. Alistair did not move. He watched the subtle twitch in Julian's hand, the way the other boy's confidence faltered under the weight of an opponent who refused to play by the rules. Around them, the murmurs of the students died out completely. The hall became a vacuum, a space where only the two of them existed. Alistair felt the cold stone beneath his boots, a grounding anchor in the chaos. He knew the cost of his defiance. He knew that by standing here, he had severed the final thread of neutrality. He was the outcast, the anomaly that the Academy could no longer ignore. He shifted his weight, his muscles coiled and ready, a predator in a den of gilded statues. Julian took a half step back, a crack in the facade. The lines of the coming war were no longer theoretical. Alistair felt a grim satisfaction bloom in his chest. He was ready for the fallout. He looked past Julian, toward the shadowed arches, and saw the future as a path he had chosen. The war for Blackwood had begun. The tension did not dissipate. It solidified. Alistair held his ground, his breathing steady, his eyes locked on the path ahead. Around him, the great hall seemed to dim, the magically charged lanterns flickering one by one until only shadows remained. He felt the weight of the coming conflict, a cold pressure against his skin, yet he did not recoil. He turned his head, scanning the vaulted ceiling and the darkened corridors. Acknowledging the battlefield that Blackwood had become, there would be no retreat, there would be no compromise. He tightened his grip, his knuckles white, and allowed a single, sharp breath to escape his lips. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of ozone and impending change. He looked directly into the lens of the future, his expression hardening into a mask of absolute resolve. The conflict had arrived, and he was the spark that would burn it all down.